The summer of 1944, Normandy, France. Sergeant James Mitchell crouches behind his M4 Sherman, hands trembling as he watches another tank in his platoon erupt in flames, the third one this week. Inside that burning metal coffin, 5 men who shared breakfast with him just hours ago are now gone. He looks at his own Sherman and realizes something that churns his stomach. The same thing could happen to him at any moment. This is the reality American tank crews faced in the European theater. Their Shermans, reliable and mass-produced marvels of American engineering, were being outgunned and out-armored by German Panthers and Tigers. But what happened next wasn't written in any manual. It didn't come from headquarters or from the engineering corps in Detroit. It came from desperation, ingenuity, and the will to survive. This is the true story of how American tankers took matters into their own hands and transformed their vulnerable Shermans into something the Germans never expected. A story of improvisation under fire, of a general's controversial decision, and of modifications that would save hundreds of lives before the war's end. June 1944. The bocage country of Normandy presents a nightmare for tank warfare. Dense hedgerows create natural fortifications every 100 yards. German anti-tank guns hide in the shadows, waiting. Panzerfaust teams lurk behind every stone wall. And the dreaded German armor, Panthers and Tigers, turn the narrow lanes between hedgerows into corridors of destruction. The M4 Sherman was never designed for this. Back in 1942, when production began, the Sherman was considered a solid medium tank. Its 75mm gun could handle anything the Germans had at the time. Its armor, ranging from 1.5 to 3 inches thick, seemed adequate. Most importantly, it was reliable. Unlike the temperamental German tanks that broke down constantly, the Sherman just worked. But by 1944, the game had changed. The German Panther tank mounted a 75mm high-velocity gun that could punch through a Sherman's armor from over a mile away. The Tiger's 88mm gun was even more devastating. Meanwhile, the Sherman's gun struggled to penetrate German armor except at dangerously close range, and close range in the bocage meant suicide. American tank crews knew the math. They knew the statistics that headquarters tried to keep quiet. For every German tank destroyed, the Allies lost roughly 4 Shermans. The crews had a dark joke. They called themselves 5-man coffins on tracks. But soldiers don't just accept their fate. They adapt. They improvise. They fight back with whatever means available. The first modification appeared almost immediately after the Normandy landings. Sandbags. It seemed logical enough. Sandbags stop bullets, right? They'd been used for protection since the dawn of modern warfare. Why not use them on tanks? Crews began piling sandbags on their Shermans wherever they could fit them. On the front glacis plate, along the sides, around the turret, some tanks carried up to 170 sandbags, layered 2 to 4 deep. The added weight was enormous, over 3 tons in some cases, but the crews felt safer. They convinced themselves that those sandbags made a difference. The psychological effect was real. Men who'd watched their friends perish in burning tanks felt they were doing something to protect themselves. The sandbags became a security blanket, a tangible response to an impossible situation. But the reality was harsh. Sandbags might stop rifle bullets and small shell fragments, but against an 88mm armor-piercing round traveling at over 2,000 feet per second, they were worthless. The shell would tear through the sandbags like tissue paper and continue into the tank's armor as if the sandbags weren't even there. Worse, the added weight created serious mechanical problems. The Sherman's suspension system wasn't designed for an extra 3 tons. Springs sagged. Bogie wheels wore out faster. The additional strain on the drivetrain led to more frequent breakdowns, and in combat, a broken-down tank is a dead tank. But the crews kept adding sandbags, because doing something felt better than doing nothing, because they were desperate, because they were facing an enemy with superior firepower, and they needed every psychological advantage they could get. Then came another improvisation: tank tracks. Not the tracks on the ground, but spare track links welded to the hull and turret as additional armor. This seemed even more logical than sandbags. Track links were made of hardened steel. They were heavy and dense. Surely they would provide protection. American, British, Canadian, and Polish tank crews all adopted this modification. Spare track links were relatively easy to come by. Destroyed tanks littered the battlefield, and their tracks could be salvaged. Maintenance crews could weld the links onto vulnerable areas with relative ease. The tracks gave the Shermans a distinctive, almost medieval appearance. They looked armored, reinforced, ready for battle. Crews felt more confident. Commanders felt they were taking proactive measures to protect their men, but again, the reality fell short of the hope. Tank tracks weren't made from armor-grade steel. They were designed for durability and flexibility, not for stopping armor-piercing rounds. The steel was too soft, too thin in places. In fact, engineering studies later revealed that track links could actually make things worse. When an armor-piercing shell hit a sloped plate, the angle often caused it to deflect or ricochet. But when that same shell hit a track link first, the irregular surface could normalize the round, turning it perpendicular to the armor underneath. Instead of deflecting, the shell would now strike the hull at a more favorable angle for penetration. The added weight created the same problems as the sandbags: more stress on the suspension, more strain on the engine and transmission, slower acceleration, reduced maneuverability. In tank combat, speed and agility often mean the difference between life and ending up as a burning wreck. But still, the crews kept welding on track links, because they needed to believe they were safer, because the alternative was accepting their vulnerability and climbing into their tanks each morning, knowing they were riding in inadequately protected vehicles. Some crews tried logs, large logs strapped to the sides of the tank. The theory was similar to sandbags and tracks, an additional layer between the enemy and the crew. At least the log served a dual purpose. They could be unstrapped and placed under the tracks for traction in muddy terrain. But as armor, largely ineffective against anti-tank rounds. By July 1944, General George Patton had seen enough. His Third Army was preparing for the breakout from Normandy, Operation Cobra. He needed his tanks fast, mobile, and mechanically reliable. He needed them to exploit breakthroughs and race across France. He didn't need them weighted down with ineffective modifications that broke their suspensions and slowed them down. Patton was never known for subtle diplomacy. When he'd discovered the extent of the sandbag modifications in his command, he was furious. He issued a direct order: remove the sandbags, all of them, immediately. The tankers were stunned. They felt betrayed. Here was a general, safe in his headquarters, ordering them to strip away the protection they'd painstakingly added. Protection that made them feel safer, even if the actual benefit was questionable. But Patton understood something the individual crews didn't see. The Sherman's real advantage wasn't armor. It was mobility, reliability, and numbers. The Sherman could go places the heavier German tanks couldn't. It could keep fighting when Panthers broke down. And there were so many Shermans that even with the unfavorable loss ratios, American armor could overwhelm German positions through sheer weight of numbers. The sandbags had to go. The Third Army needed to move fast. But Patton wasn't heartless. He understood his men's fear. He understood they needed protection. He just needed them to use the right kind of protection. And that's when the real solution emerged. Not sandbags, not track links, not logs, actual armor plate. The idea was simple, but hadn't been widely implemented yet. Armor from destroyed tanks. Both Allied and German vehicles littered the battlefields of France. Many were total wrecks, but their armor plate was still good. That armor had been designed specifically to stop anti-tank rounds. It was the right thickness, the right hardness, the right grade of steel. Why not salvage it and weld it onto the Shermans? The engineering and maintenance companies in Patton's Third Army went to work. They scoured battlefields and salvage yards for usable armor plate. They cut sections from destroyed Shermans. They even used armor from knocked-out German tanks, Panthers, and Tigers that would never fight again but whose armor could now protect American crews. The salvaged plates were welded onto weak points on the Shermans, hatches which were flat and vulnerable, driver's ports, areas where the armor was thinner, the turret front, where German rounds often struck first. This wasn't random improvisation. Engineers calculated angles and placement. They ensured the additional armor didn't interfere with the tank's operation. They tested to make sure the welds would hold under battlefield conditions. The difference was immediate and measurable. When a Sherman with properly applied armor plate took a hit, the additional layer often stopped or deflected rounds that would have penetrated the standard armor. Crews began reporting survivable hits. Tanks that would have been destroyed instead returned to base with damage that could be repaired. More importantly, the weight was distributed properly. Unlike sandbags piled haphazardly wherever there was space, the armor plates were carefully placed. The mechanical strain was manageable. The tanks remained mobile and reliable. Patton saw the results and made a decision that would affect hundreds of tanks and save countless lives. In late 1944 and early 1945, he ordered engineers to modify over 200 Shermans in his command using salvaged armor plate. This was a massive undertaking. Each modification took time, skill, and materials, but Patton prioritized it. He gave the engineering units the resources they needed. The modified Shermans became known as expedient, or field-modified tanks. They didn't have an official designation. They weren't part of a standardized program. Each one was slightly different, depending on what armor was available and what the engineers determined was needed for that particular tank. But they all had one thing in common: they worked. Sergeant Mitchell, whose story opened this account, was one of the lucky ones. His Sherman received the armor modification in September 1944. A month later, during the advance toward the German border, his tank took a direct hit from a Panther. The German round struck the welded armor plate on his glacis, just above the driver's hatch. The additional layer was enough. The round penetrated the salvaged armor, but didn't make it through the Sherman's original armor beneath. The impact knocked Mitchell senseless for a few seconds, but when he came to, his crew was alive. The tank was damaged, but operational. They backed out of the kill zone and made it back to friendly lines. That night, examining the damage, Mitchell ran his hand over the 2 layers of armor. The outer plate was pierced. The inner plate was scarred, but intact. 5 men went home to their families because someone had welded that extra plate in place. But the story doesn't end with Patton's field modifications. There was also an official response to the Sherman's vulnerability. The M4A3E2, nicknamed the Jumbo. The Jumbo Sherman was conceived as an assault tank. Its frontal armor was increased from 3 inches to over 6 inches. The turret front went from 3 inches to nearly 7 inches. The gun mantlet was massive. This wasn't salvaged armor welded on. This was a tank built from the factory with legitimate heavy armor. In appearance, the Jumbo looked like a Sherman that had been to the gym and bulked up. The thicker armor meant the driver's and bow gunner's hatches were recessed. The whole front of the tank looked more substantial, more imposing. The performance matched the appearance. In testing and in combat, Jumbos proved nearly invulnerable from the front, even against Tiger and Panther guns at normal combat ranges. Crews nicknamed them King Shermans. Finally, American tankers had something that could go toe-to-toe with German heavy armor and come out on top. Only 254 Jumbos were produced. That might seem like a small number given how effective they were, but there were reasons. The extra armor made them significantly heavier, which slowed them down by 3 to 4 miles per hour. They required more powerful engines to maintain performance. And most importantly, producing Jumbos meant producing fewer standard Shermans, and the Army needed quantity as much as quality. Those 254 jumbos were distributed across various armored units. They often led advances using their superior protection to break through German defenses, while regular Shermans followed and exploited the breakthrough. One jumbo became particularly famous. Cobra King, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Boggess of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division. On December 26, 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, Cobra King became the first American tank to reach the besieged forces at Bastogne. The jumbo had smashed through German lines, survived multiple hits, and brought relief to the surrounded 101st Airborne Division. When General Patton saw what the jumbo could do, he wanted more. He requested additional jumbos for his Third Army. But production had already stopped. The factory had moved on to other variants, so Patton's engineers took the concept and applied it their way. They created expedient jumbos, standard Shermans modified with so much salvaged armor that they approached the protection level of a real jumbo. Among the most famous of these field-modified tanks was Thunderbolt 7, commanded by Colonel Creighton Abrams. Abrams was already a legendary tank commander, aggressive and skilled. His tank matched his reputation. Thunderbolt 7 was a M4A376W HVSS, the late-war Sherman variant with the better 76mm gun and improved suspension. But what made it special was the armor. Thunderbolt 7 had welded armor plates on the glacis, the sides, and the turret. Some of the side armor was hollow, creating a standoff that made German Panzerfaust rockets less effective. The added protection made the tank noticeably heavier, but Abrams and his crew considered it a worthwhile trade. They were often in the thick of combat, leading advances, and they needed every advantage. The tank became a symbol. When other crews saw Thunderbolt 7 rolling past, armor plates welded all over like a patchwork knight, they knew they were looking at a survivor, a tank that had been hit, that had taken everything the Germans threw at it, and was still fighting. Abrams would go on to become Chief of Staff of the United States Army. The M1 Abrams tank, the main battle tank of the U.S. military today, bears his name, but in 1944 and 1945 he was a colonel commanding a tank battalion, and his modified Sherman was proving every day that ingenuity and determination could overcome technical disadvantages. The impact of these modifications, both the official jumbos and the field-modified tanks, was significant, but hard to quantify precisely. How do you count lives saved? How do you measure the confidence boost that came from knowing your tank had a better chance of protecting you? We know that crews in modified tanks reported higher survival rates from direct hits. We know that the modifications improved morale significantly. Men who had been afraid to button up and fight became more aggressive, more willing to take necessary risks when they trusted their armor. We also know that the German response changed. German tank commanders and anti-tank gunners learned to identify modified Shermans. Intelligence reports from captured German documents show they considered the heavily modified tanks to be priority targets. This actually worked in the Allies' favor. If the Germans were concentrating fire on the tanks best able to survive it, they were giving the standard Shermans a slightly better chance. The modifications weren't perfect. Adding armor meant adding weight, and physics doesn't negotiate. Heavier tanks stressed their components more. They moved slower. They consumed more fuel. In some cases, the added weight caused suspensions to fail at inopportune moments. There were also questions about whether all modifications were beneficial. Some units got creative, welding on armor at angles that might actually have channeled enemy rounds into more vulnerable spots. Quality control was inconsistent. A modification done by experienced engineers with proper equipment was one thing. A modification done by a crew in a field with limited resources was another. But overall, the program was successful enough that it continued throughout the war. By early 1945, as Allied armies pushed into Germany, A significant portion of American tanks in frontline units had some form of additional armor. The salvage operations became more sophisticated. Engineers knew which parts of destroyed tanks yielded the best armor plate. They developed standard patterns for certain types of modifications. Some historians argue that the field modifications, combined with the lessons learned from the Jumbo program, influenced post-war tank design. The American military learned that crews would always seek additional protection, so you might as well build it into the tank from the start rather than have them improvise in the field. It's worth noting that the Germans faced similar issues, but from the opposite direction. German tanks like the Tiger and King Tiger had excellent armor and powerful guns, but they were mechanically unreliable, difficult to produce, and consumed fuel at unsustainable rates. When a Tiger broke down, which happened frequently, it often had to be destroyed by its own crew to prevent capture. The Germans didn't have the luxury of salvaging and repairing. The Sherman, even in its basic form, could be repaired quickly. Standardized parts meant that maintenance units could cannibalize damaged tanks to keep others running. The famous American logistics system meant that replacement tanks, spare parts, and fresh crews were always flowing to the front. The armor modifications amplified these advantages. A modified Sherman that took a hit but survived could be repaired and sent back into action, often within days. The armor plate welded on wasn't just protection. It was an investment that paid dividends every time a tank survived to fight another day. Let's return to the human element, because that's what this story is really about. The individual tankers who faced death every time they climbed into their vehicles. Private First Class Tommy Rodriguez was a driver on a Sherman in the 2nd Armored Division. In November 1944, his tank was moving through a German town when a Panzerfaust rocket struck the side. The rocket penetrated the sponson, the area above the tracks, and detonated inside. Rodriguez was knocked unconscious. When he came to, the tank was filling with smoke. The radio operator was wounded, but they were alive. Later, examining the damage, they found that the rocket had actually penetrated 2 layers of armor. The original Sherman armor and a layer of salvaged armor welded over a previous repair. The double penetration had absorbed enough energy that the warhead's detonation was less effective than it should have been. The rocket spent its force getting through both layers. Without that extra armor, the entire crew would likely have perished. Rodriguez wrote home about it. His letter, preserved in a museum collection, is matter of fact. The tank got hit. The extra armor saved us. Back to fighting tomorrow. Just another day in the war. Stories like Rodriguez's were common, but rarely made it into official reports. Tank crews were superstitious about discussing their good fortune. They didn't want to jinx themselves. But after the war, when veterans organizations began collecting oral histories, the accounts emerged. A commander in the 4th Armored Division estimated that the armor modifications in his battalion prevented at least a dozen crew losses over 3 months. That's 60 men in just one battalion. Multiply that across all the units that used modified tanks, and the number of lives saved climbs into the hundreds, possibly over 1,000. The modifications also had an unexpected tactical benefit. The Germans learned to fear the heavily armored Shermans. When a German position spotted a column of modified tanks approaching, their defensive calculations changed. They knew these weren't the easy targets they'd encountered in Normandy. These tanks could take hits and keep coming. Psychological warfare works both ways. Just as the Sherman crew's morale improved with better protection, German morale suffered when their best shots bounced off or failed to stop the advance. There were failures, of course. War is never neat. Some modified tanks were still destroyed. Some armor modifications proved ineffective against certain weapons or certain angles of attack. The Panzerfaust, particularly the later models with larger warheads, could still threaten even heavily modified tanks at close range. But the program succeeded in its fundamental goal. It kept more crews alive It kept more tanks in action. It gave American tankers a fighting chance against technically superior German armor. The engineering and maintenance units deserve recognition in this story. These weren't frontline combat troops. They were welders, mechanics, and metallurgists working just behind the lines. They worked in all weather, often under dangerous conditions, to modify tanks and get them back to the fighting units. Master Sergeant Edward Kowalski ran a tank modification team in the Third Army. His unit could modify a Sherman in about 3 days, working around the clock. They had a system. First, assess the tank and determine the best placement for additional armor. Second, source the armor plate from salvage. Third, carefully weld it in place, checking for proper penetration and structural integrity. Finally, test the tank to ensure the modifications didn't interfere with operation. Kowalski's team modified 67 tanks between October 1944 and March 1945. 67 tanks with improved protection, 67 crews with a better chance of survival. How many lives did that save? Kowalski never knew. The crews he protected were always moving forward, fighting, winning. He never got to hear most of their stories, but after the war, a few veterans tracked him down to say thank you. The extra armor had made the difference. The British and Canadian armies also adopted armor modifications, though their approach differed slightly. The British were more systematic, establishing formal modification programs at depot level. The Canadians, like the Americans, tended toward field expedients, but with close cooperation from their engineering units. The various Allied approaches shared a common thread: soldiers on the ground identifying a problem and implementing solutions with the resources available. This was the democratic way of war. German armies operated on rigid command structures. Modifications required approval through multiple levels of bureaucracy. Allied armies, for all their faults, allowed more initiative at lower levels. This flexibility extended beyond armor modifications. American tank crews also improvised better gun sights, improved communication systems, and field repairs that would have horrified the original designers but kept tanks running. As the war entered its final months in early 1945, the nature of tank combat changed again. The Germans were in retreat. Fuel shortages immobilized many of their heavy tanks. The Allies had air superiority, meaning German armor faced constant threat from above. Tank versus tank engagements became less common. The Sherman's role shifted more toward infantry support, but the armor modifications remained relevant. German infantry still had Panzerfausts. German anti-tank guns still guarded key positions. And in urban combat, fighting through German cities, tanks faced threats from all directions. The additional armor, particularly on the sides and turret, provided protection from shots that became more common as combat moved into built-up areas. The final major battle for many American tank units was the crossing of the Rhine River and the subsequent drive into the heart of Germany. At the Remagen Bridge, the intact crossing that became a critical opportunity for the Allies, both jumbos and field-modified Shermans played crucial roles. The heavier tanks led the assault across the bridge, their armor allowing them to withstand fire from German positions on the far bank. Interestingly, the super-heavy Pershing tanks, America's answer to the Tiger, were too wide to cross the Remagen Bridge initially. The Shermans, including the modified ones, crossed first and established the bridgehead. Once again, the Sherman's combination of adequate protection, good mobility, and reliability proved more valuable than theoretical superiority on paper. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, attention turned to the Pacific. Plans were being drawn for the invasion of Japan. Tank crews who'd fought through Europe wondered if they'd be sent to fight in a completely different environment. The armor modification lessons from Europe would have applied in the Pacific as well, but the war ended before the invasion became necessary. Still, in the Pacific campaigns that did occur, Marines used Shermans with field modifications similar to those in Europe. The threat was different, mostly close-range anti-tank weapons and infantry attacks, but the solution was the same. Additional armor at weak points, carefully applied to maintain mobility. After the war, the U.S. Army conducted extensive studies of tank performance. The data on modified Shermans was compiled and analyzed. The conclusions supported what the crews already knew. Properly applied armor modifications significantly improved survivability without unacceptable reductions in performance. These lessons influenced the design of post-war American tanks. The M46 Patton, the M47, and eventually the M48 all incorporated thicker armor as standard. The designers had learned that crews would always want more protection, so build it in from the start. But they also learned the importance of balance. The Sherman succeeded despite its armor limitations because it was reliable, mobile, and available in large numbers. Post-war tank design tried to maintain that balance. Enough armor to protect the crew, but not so much that the tank became slow and unreliable. The modified Shermans of World War II represent a unique moment in military history, a time when individual soldiers, faced with a life or death problem, took matters into their own hands. They experimented. They failed with sandbags and track links, but they succeeded with salvaged armor plate, and when higher command recognized what worked, they supported it and scaled it up. General Patton, often portrayed as a rigid disciplinarian, showed flexibility when it mattered. He banned ineffective modifications, but embraced effective ones. He provided resources for a large-scale modification program, even as his armies were advancing rapidly across Europe. He understood that protecting his men was ultimately more important than strict adherence to standard procedures. The tank crews themselves showed remarkable resilience and ingenuity. They didn't just accept their fate. They didn't just follow orders. They identified problems and implemented solutions. Yes, some of their early attempts were ineffective, but they learned and adapted. The maintenance and engineering units demonstrated the unsung heroism of support troops. While they didn't face direct combat as often as frontline units, they worked tirelessly to keep the fighting forces equipped and protected. Their skill with cutting torches and welders was as important as the tankers' skill with guns and gunnery. Today, the few remaining Sherman tanks in museums occasionally show evidence of field modifications, weld marks where armor plates were added, reinforced hatches, thickened glacis plates. These scars tell stories of desperation and ingenuity, of men who refused to accept unnecessary risk when solutions existed. Historians debate the exact number of lives saved by armor modifications. Some estimates suggest several hundred tank crew members survived hits that would have been fatal without the extra armor. Other estimates run higher, into the thousands, when accounting for all Allied forces that used similar modifications. The precise number doesn't matter as much as the principle. Soldiers faced a problem, they solved it, lives were saved. The war was won, in part, because American, British, and Canadian forces were able to adapt and overcome technical disadvantages through ingenuity and industrial capacity. The Sherman tank, often criticized for its limitations, actually exemplified American strengths. It wasn't the most powerful tank, it wasn't the most heavily armored tank, but it was reliable, it was producible, and it could be improved and adapted in the field. These characteristics, combined with the initiative of soldiers and the support of command structures willing to embrace effective modifications, made the Sherman and its crews a formidable force. Sergeant James Mitchell survived the war. He returned to his hometown in Pennsylvania, married his sweetheart, and worked in a steel mill for 40 years. He rarely talked about his time in the war, but in his garage he kept a small piece of armor plate, a section he'd cut from his Sherman when it was finally retired in late 1945. It had a scar on it where a German round had struck and failed to penetrate. Sometimes late at night, He'd go to the garage and run his hand over that scar, remembering the day it saved his life and the lives of his crew. Thousands of veterans have similar memories. A hit that should have killed them, but didn't. A modification that made the difference between going home and ending up as another statistic. The armor plates welded onto their tanks weren't just metal, they were hope. They were proof that someone cared about their survival. They were the physical manifestation of the truth that while technology and tactics matter, ultimately war is about people and their will to survive and protect each other. The story of Sherman armor modifications is part of the larger story of how the Allies won World War II. It wasn't through technological superiority, at least not in every category. It was through adaptability, logistics, production capacity, and the initiative of individual soldiers making the best of their equipment. The tanker who suggested using salvaged armor, the engineer who figured out how to weld it properly, the general who supported scaling up the program, the maintenance crews who worked through the night to modify tanks, each played a part. In the end, the Sherman and its crews proved that wars aren't won by having the best equipment on paper. They're won by having equipment that's good enough, available in sufficient quantities, supported by competent logistics, and crewed by soldiers smart enough to identify and solve problems. The armor modifications were just one example of this principle in action, but they saved lives and contributed to victory. That's what matters. The modified Shermans rolling through France, Belgium, and Germany in 1944 and 1945 were symbols of Allied determination. They'd been hit, they'd been hurt, but they'd been repaired and improved. They kept fighting, just like the soldiers who crewed them, just like the nations they represented. Not perfect, not invulnerable, but resilient, adaptable, and ultimately victorious. Every scar on those armor plates represented a moment when death was cheated. Every weld represented hope. Every modified tank was a promise to the crew. We're doing everything we can to bring you home. In war, that promise can never be guaranteed. But with ingenuity, determination, and practical modifications born from experience and necessity, that promise was kept for hundreds of men who otherwise might have been lost. This is the real story, not of invulnerability or perfect solutions, but of soldiers and engineers working together to improve their odds, one tank at a time, one armor plate at a time, one life at a time. It's a story worth remembering, not for glory or triumph, but for what it reveals about human ingenuity under pressure and the measures people will take to protect their own. The Sherman tank's legacy is complex. In popular memory, it's often portrayed as inferior to German armor, but the crews who fought in them knew better. Especially the crews whose modified Shermans took hits and survived. They knew that with the right improvements, their tanks could stand up to anything the Germans had. They knew that American industrial might, combined with soldier ingenuity, was an unbeatable combination. The war ended 79 years ago, but the lessons remain relevant. Adapt to circumstances, support innovation from below, provide resources for effective solutions, protect your people with every means available. These principles applied then, they apply now. They'll apply in future conflicts. The modified Shermans of World War II were more than just tanks with extra armor. They were testaments to human resilience, ingenuity, and the unwillingness to accept unnecessary risk when solutions exist. They remind us that technology alone doesn't win wars. People win wars. People who think, adapt, improvise, and never give up. Somewhere in a museum, a restored Sherman sits with armor plates welded to its hull. Visitors walk past, maybe noticing the modifications, maybe not. But each of those weld marks represents a choice to fight smarter, not just harder, a choice to protect men's lives, a choice that mattered to someone's father, grandfather, or great-grandfather who came home from the war because someone else cared enough to weld on an extra plate of armor. That's the story that deserves to be told, not just of tanks and battles, but of the moments of human connection that made survival possible. The engineer who did quality work on a weld. The commander who approved resources for modifications. The crew that maintained their modified tank properly. Each link in the chain mattered. War is terrible. This story doesn't glorify it. But within the horror of war, humans found ways to care for each other. The armor modifications were an act of caring. I'm going to make your tank safer because your life matters. Multiplied across hundreds of tanks and thousands of men, that caring made a difference. The thunder of guns has long since faded. The men who fought in those modified Shermans are mostly gone now, their stories fading into history. But the principle remains. When people are in danger, you do what you can to protect them. You don't accept the status quo if improvements are possible. You innovate, you adapt, you weld on whatever armor is available. That's the legacy. That's what the modified Shermans teach us. Not just about tank warfare or World War II, but about human nature at its best. Facing impossible odds, soldiers and engineers found a way to improve their chances. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough to prevent all losses. But it was something. And in war, something is infinitely better than nothing. The Sherman tank rolled off American production lines by the tens of thousands, but the modified Shermans, with their patchwork armor and welded plates, those were special. Each one was unique. Each one represented specific choices made by specific people to protect specific crews. Each one was a small act of defiance against the waste of war. Each one said, "Not today, not these men, not if we can help it." And for hundreds of tank crews, that made all the difference.